A new and interesting crop in the state, which, if you kind of look at it, it's really not new. We've been growing soybeans for years, but edamame is a new venture that some of the producers have been having the last couple of years. Kind of initially started 2 years ago. This past year was the initial large-scale production. And we'll kind of talk about some of the things we looked at. When you look at edamame, you would think, that's just a soybean, and you would treat it just like normal soybeans, and that's not the case. And so we ran into some issues, and we're still trying to get through some issues to help these producers produce the crop in the state. But we'll kind of, give an update on what we know so far. Edamame, as everybody hopefully knows by now, if you had some samples at the break, are just the green beans. They look like normal soybeans. They're a little bit bigger. Edamame actually translated as beans on a branch. Native of Japan. It's still a glycine max, but it's been bred, for certain characteristics. It's usually a larger seed soybean than typically what we see in commercial varieties, a sweeter flavor and a creamier texture. A company came in 2 years ago and kind of was interested in looking at this, mainly looking at the Arkansas River Valley, just because there's less commercial agriculture in that particular area. Edamames are conventional beans, so they were looking at that area to try to avoid some of the drift issues that we have in the eastern side of the state, and trying to look at some niche markets and other things like that in that particular area of the state. And so Arkansas, our American Vegetable, Soybean, and Edamame Company actually put in a processing plant in Mulberry this past year. They contracted out about 900 acres of soybeans in 2012. 2013, they're looking at around 2,000 acres. And eventually, I think the long-term goal is looking at somewhere around 10,000 acres in the state. So it's going to have to venture out of the Arkansas River Valley and come over to the eastern side of the state. And we're in the process of trying to get recommendations, for producing the edamame and other things like that to try to help these producers. Dr. Chen's program has been looking at edamame for several years. And one of the varieties that we evaluated this year in a lot of our tests is actually a variety that Dr. Chen bred. So objectives, we had a small proposal last year. We're going to have a couple of different proposals this year looking at different aspects. The main objective of the proposal was to establish extension research and demonstration to try to get as much information as possible. And so a lot of us kind of went out and did a shotgun approach, putting out as many plots as we can, trying to figure out exactly which way we need to go, looking at fertility, herbicides, insects, disease-wise, and then trying to narrow that down to try to get the best recommendation possible. We did organize and conducted several field days. In conjunction with the Soybean Promotion Board, we had a field day at Newport this past summer, and I think my program had somewhere around 750 edamame plots, looking at different aspects, different fertility aspects, agronomic aspects. And I'll get into the harvest a little bit later, but if y'all didn't know, me and my wife had twins August the 23rd. And that was on a Thursday. We started harvesting the edamames the Wednesday, the day before I got the call and saying we was going to go in to have our twins. And so I left my crew to harvest this edamame without nobody really knowing how long it's going to take or the effort it took. And so 3 or 4 days after the twins got here, we got home, got settled, I called my crew and said, how's it going? I can't repeat some of the words they said, but the harvest was pretty intense. Being a PhD and having a good crew, my ambitions were probably a little bit grander than theirs. And so we started out, harvesting the entire plot. We went back to just pulling a subsample, and then we finally wound up just harvesting about 10 plants out of the plots to get a representative yield out of those. And so luckily, nobody quit. I'm sure they probably said several bad things about me this summer while they was trying to get that process. But we know a lot more now about edamame, and especially plot work, than we did back in the summer. So luckily, my crew didn't quit me, and we actually got some pretty good data. And then the best thing is using those research results to put in educational materials. We did in the process of trying to get some fact sheets and other things like that out to the producers to try to get that information. I'm going to run through some of the things that we've looked at on the different disciplines. Insect research, Gus Lorenz is kind of taking the lead on this. He's actually got a master's grad student, Ben Thrash, looking at this. They're looking at seed treatments with the Gaucho products and the Cruiser products and trying to get suppression of early season disease or insects. Comparing conventional varieties versus the edamame varieties to look at the impact of the insects. And what they've found is some of the insects tend to want to migrate to the edamame just because they have that sweeter taste. They're a little bit bigger, more succulent bean. And so they're looking at maybe coming in and putting some buffer strips of conventional beans right next to, the turn rows or the wood line to try to be a catch crop to kind of catch those insects before they get into the edamame. And then really the main thing, probably the biggest concern with the edamame is the stink bugs, because the processor wants a pristine pod. Any blemish on that pod gets it knocked down to a lower grade, and the price drops once you start getting some blemishes on there. And so any kind of insect damage or stink bug feeding damage is really going to be detrimental if we can't control those. But Gus is doing an outstanding job, and I commend him and Ben for looking at that. Some of the insecticides we have in use, you'd think, with edamames being a soybean, it'd be pretty much opened up. Anything we can put on soybeans, we can put on edamame. That's not the case. We're limited on what we can put. This is pretty much the complete list we've got right now. Insecticides and fungicides are, we feel pretty confident with that, but our herbicides, I'll talk about the herbicides here in just a minute, but I got to commend Bob Scott and Nilda Burgos for the work they're doing on trying to get us a few more post-application herbicides to try to combat some of these broadleaf problems we're having. But you can kind of see the insecticides, Capture, Cruiser, Mustang, some of the ones we can use. We can control some of the problems in edamame. Disease-wise, we're looking at fungicide studies, nematode screening, variety screening, looking at disease reactions. The one variety, the JYC variety that we're looking at is a Japanese variety, and so we really have no characteristics or how it performed until this year. We looked at it on a wide scale, and so we really need to know, just like any normal soybean, we need to know what this disease reaction is going to be out in the field. A little bit smaller list of fungicides that are available. You can see Headline, Quadris are the two main ones that we probably look. Apron's the old product, and some of those others. But again, we're not, everything we can put on soybeans, commercial soybeans, is just not available to put on edamames. Weeds, we're looking at herbicide sensitivity trials and post-herbicides. Again, Dr. Scott and Nilda Burgos are looking at these. This is probably the list that we have the biggest problem with. And this is pretty much all the herbicides we have to work with. And we're in the process of working with the companies, working with the plant board to try to get some more post options. Probably the biggest thing we had this year, and Bob correct me, is on weed-wise was sickle pod and morning glories. And so when you're in a conventional rotation and you're having to use conventional herbicides, those conventional herbicides really didn't work well, 15, 20 years ago when we had sickle pod and morning glory problems, and we're just starting to see that same issue. And they actually had to abandon about 30 acres, I believe, of the edamame because the morning glories were so bad they couldn't get in there and harvest the edamame. So I've got to tip my hat to Bob and Nilda for doing over and above, trying to get us some other post options to try to control some of these problematic weeds. And so some of the studies I looked at, mainly looking at fertility, because we really didn't know how the edamame, we assumed since they were soybeans they would probably act like soybeans in fertility-wise, but we really didn't know. So we kind of did a shotgun approach to try to answer some of these questions. So real quick, we did a seeding rate study. Looking at different seeding rates, the company was using a lot of their recommendations were Japanese and Chinese recommendations. So we really didn't know how these varieties were going to perform or their agronomic characteristics were going to perform in Arkansas. The company suggested around 80,000 seed per acre for their planting population for the edamame. You want a thinner stand because you want these plants to be bushy. You want them to put on as much pods as possible. And so if you used a high seeding rate, you would narrow up those plants, make them a little bit taller, a little bit more narrow, and then they just wouldn't put the pods on like they would at a lower seeding rate. The two varieties we looked at, JYC, which is the Japanese variety, UA Kirksey, which is a release from Dr. Chen's program, 50,000, 75, 100, and 125,000. So you can see we're really almost half, of what a normal soybean population would be when we're looking at just normal conventional populations. But we did on harvest, we cut the 2 middle rows, and we did this for all of our tests. There were 20-foot plots, cut the 2 middle rows. We took that back, and originally we started hand harvesting, pulling the pods off. We determined that took a little bit longer than we anticipated, so I've got a technician that's pretty forward-thinking, and he developed this kind of I said it looked like a duck picker, but it had fingers on it, and he put it on a drill, and if OSHA saw it, they'd probably shut us down pretty quick, but they were able to get the pods off a little bit quicker than sitting there trying to pull them off with our hands. And you can see the bundles. We just bundled it up, took it back to the lab, and pulled the seed off. So we had this across, again, two different varieties, the seeding rates. And if you look, most of the research that I was able to find was in horticulture publications. And when you're dealing with horticulture publications and you're talking about very small plots, most of the plot work in the horticulture was a single 5-foot row that was hand planted, hand weeded, hand watered. Then once the beans got to the maturity, they went out and hand harvested the beans off those plants. And there's really nothing, wide scale, large scale, plot work data, and so we're kind of on the cutting edge, and so we really didn't know, kind of how to grade these beans, and so we determined to go ahead and weigh them, pull out our 3 bean pods, 2 bean pods, and then our other category. So our 3 bean pods are, pods with 3 solid beans, this would probably be a grade A bean. The 2 bean pods is typically, if they have no blemishes on them, they'll probably get lumped in with that grade A. If there are some blemishes, more than likely these particular beans will probably be shelled for salad bars and other things like that. And then our other category, this is the pods that had either a single bean or flat pods or anything like that. So if you take the total weight of the 3 bean, 2 bean, and other, that'll give you the grand total for that particular plot. But the main take-home message, we did see some statistically different when we compared the UA Kirksey versus the JYC. The reason we're probably seeing a greater yield with the Kirksey is because it's an adapted variety for Arkansas. It's out of Dr. Chen's program. It's been grown in Arkansas environments for the last several years during the breeding process. And so that's the reason we're probably seeing a greater yield with the Kirksey as opposed to the JYC. JYC does have larger seed. It is more desirable than for the Asian market. UA Kirksey has a little bit smaller seed, but it also produces a few more pods than the JYC. So that's the reason we're probably seeing a little bit higher yield with our UA Kirksey. If we look at their seeding rate, we got our greatest seeding rate at 50 to 75 for the Kirksey. It really didn't matter with the JYC. We're still seeing, no significance when we have increased our yield over 50,000 seed per acre. So, we're right in there somewhere around where the company recommended, somewhere around that 80,000. When you look at the 2 bean pod, really didn't see much difference in any of the treatments, and then just some slight differences. We did see a few more, statistically more other pods in the JYC. And again, I think that's just because of the adaptation of the Kirksey was a little bit better than the JYC. We had a lot more flat pods or pods with no beans on it with the Kirksey as opposed to with the JYC as opposed to the Kirksey. So, this is kind of gives an idea on our seeding rate. I think, the company's pretty much on par, looking at 80,000. Real quick, this is probably the biggest test we had. This is looking at nitrogen rates, timings, and products. Again, the 2 different varieties. We looked at urea with agrotane and ammonium sulfate. We looked at 3 or 4 different applications, and then on top of that, we looked at multiple applications. And so we went anywhere from 0 pounds of nitrogen all the way up to 100 pounds of nitrogen when we looked at applications at all 4 timings. So we had, for each variety, we had 17 treatments, and so this entire test was a 34 treatment test, and so it was pretty overwhelming. Initial analysis, looking at the data, similar to what we saw with the seeding rate study. We did get a significantly different yields between the varieties. We got higher yields with the UA Kirksey as opposed to the JYC. Again, I think it's because of the adaptiveness of the Kirksey and the non-adaptiveness of the JYC. But what really surprised me, and we kind of saw this with some of our nitrogen rate studies that we've been looking at in conventional or commercial soybeans the last couple of years, it really didn't matter if we put on nothing versus 100 pounds. We didn't see any kind of yield increase with the application of nitrogen. The first thing is we, soybeans had been planted here in the past 3 years, and we did have good nodulation. And so I think, because of the good nodulation with soybeans being in the history, we just didn't have, an increase in using nitrogen looking at that. Similar study looking at K rates. Again, 2 varieties. We looked at 2 different products, potassium sulfate and muriate of potash. 3 different rates. Again, we did have statistically different yields when we compared varieties. Again, the Kirksey was higher than the JYC, but we really didn't see much of a difference when we looked at the product rates or the different products. And again, it's not surprising. Good fertility location. We wouldn't expect, if we have optimum fertility, we wouldn't expect to see a difference in our rate or our product. And we also looked at a P rate. Again, 2 different varieties, 1 single source, and then we had the 5 different rates. Again, no significant difference when we looked at rates or the timing, but we did have a significant increase in when we had to compare the 2 different varieties. And so that kind of gives you an idea of where we're going. Again, we kind of did a shotgun approach looking at this. I can tell you right now, we're not going to have a 34 treatment nitrogen test next year because my crew will probably walk out on me. And so, but doing that, we get a good idea of where we need to focus our interest. We're going to probably continue looking at the P&K research to try to get some good recommendations on that. Right now, the company is still recommending 25 pounds of nitrogen pre-plant. We're probably going to express our concerns on that you're probably not really getting a whole lot of benefit from that. A lot of recommendations that is coming from China and Japan, I think, is because a lot of their soils over there are less fertile than ours. I think we got a lot more soil fertility over here, and so we're not going to have to add a lot of this extra supplemental nitrogen and some of these other products to try to increase our yield. But I really didn't get to hit on everything. The Dr. Chin's program is producing a lot of neat varieties, and we're looking at that. But we're just trying to continue to try to get as much information as possible. I know the company, again, is looking around 2,000 acres in the coming year. The only downfall, and I'll have to remember, I think there's a certain distance from mulberry time-wise to get it harvested, because once they harvest it, they've got I think about 8 hours to get it processed at the plant at mulberry. So logistics of trying to get the edamame transported and then get it into the processing plant and get it through the line, there's a logistical problem there on time-wise. So interesting, until this year, the only exposure to edamame I've had is at a Japanese restaurant, and I'd pop it in my mouth and eat it and really not think that much about it. But it really kind of opened our eyes, and from the results of some of the taste tests that the company has done, their market really likes our product better than the stuff grown overseas. So I think it's, you know, a good niche market. I think, you know, it's got potential to grow pretty good. And I'm hoping to try to get as much information out to growers to try to produce this. But any questions on edamame?